welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here,
Glad
and
to be here.
glad to have a book about somebody that I have just loved from afar since I was a small boy. I would race to get the Sunday paper so I could thumb through and find 50 years ago and read it every week religiously. It was the first thing I read in the newspaper.
That's really neat.
Yeah, she was an amazing woman.
And it's amazing how many people have told me things like that she still has a lot of fans after many years.
Oh my goodness, yeah, yeah. So, what made you write this book?
Goodness, I'm sorry. Lucille was my grandfather's sister. She was my great aunt.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And but I didn't really know her. I mean, we would come to Springfield to see my great grandmother, but about a long time ago, I was a reporter at the News Leader, the paper that she had long retired from. And she used to come into the office, and she was long retired, but she still brought the 50 years ago column, which ran, and it was so long ago there was no internet, so she had to hand carry the articles. But she also would bring other articles. They were either from the Greene County Historical Society doings or something else, and she told me several times that the newspaper just hadn't covered it, and it was important and it needed to be in. And Dale Freeman, who was the managing editor, nearly always printed those articles. So I got to know her, and at the same time I began to hear stories about her from my colleagues at the newspaper and then from other people in town. And it just, over time, I apparently talked about her a lot because I had a friend who said, when are you going to write that book? And I think I finally came time to sit down and write the book.
Wow. So that's extraordinary that you related to her. That she was a great lady.
She was.
Now, when did she start in newspapers? When did she start reporting?
This is a profound accident. She got her first newspaper job in 1923, 100 years ago.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? She had been a school teacher. Her father died when she was 9, and she grew up knowing that she was going to have to take care of herself one way or another. And so, like everybody in kind of women in that situation, she became a teacher. And she got her first job at her school, where she'd gone, in Dadeville. And another teacher on the staff was a young man from the Warrensburg area who was saving his money while he was teaching because he really wanted to go out west and become a newspaper reporter. And they courted, and she fell in love, and he got a job. World War I, he went into the service, but he ended up with a job in Tulsa, and he wrote her letters about how wonderful newspapers were and how very important they were to the world, that the world would stop if there was no newspapers.
Right.
And a couple of years later, they had parted ways, and she needed to go someplace to do something exciting, so she got a job in Roswell, New Mexico. They were looking for teachers from the east, and she rode what was called the teacher's train out west and taught for a year in Roswell. At the end of the year, she had decided that she was going to come back to Missouri and save her money and go to journalism school. But she hitched a ride home with a friend who said, I'm going to go to Denver on the way home. It's out of the way, but I want to go to Denver.
Right.
And Lucille said, okay. The friend went sightseeing, and Lucille took a deep breath and went to the Denver Post and applied for a job. And they said they didn't have any openings, but they heard that the much smaller Denver Express did. So she went over to the Denver Express, and I can hear Lucille, because well, that's the next thing I'll tell. But she walked in and said, I have no experience, and I've not been to journalism school, but I'd really like a job. And the editor said, great, I love to train my own people, and hired her on the spot.
You're a blank canvas. Welcome aboard.
Yeah, welcome aboard. So that was the beginning. And she started out the lowest of the lowest of the low. She had to take over the Lovelorn column, and under the name of Cynthia Gray, not even her own name, and tell young women what to do about straying husbands and whether they should quit their job after they married.
An early Ann Landers.
Early Ann Landers, exactly. And if you read the old columns, in the beginning of the year, well, they were a little tentative because you know what she was doing. But also her advice got stronger and stronger and said you should become independent and you should, be prepared and do what you want. So that was her beginning. But early on, she was doing other things on the side. They were assigning her regular newspaper stories. And one Sunday, she was in the newsroom. The editor looked around and said, President Warren Harding's coming to town. Why don't you go over and see what's going on? So after having been a newspaper reporter for a month and a half, I think, she covered the President of the United States. And she later talked when she gave speeches about that was, just the proudest moment of her life, that she would never, when she handed her press card to the police to let her in behind the lines. So not very many people start jobs that way.
No.
But about a year later, she was tired of being Cynthia Gray, the lovelorn columnist.
Right.
And she got a job in El Paso, which she had known El Paso from when she taught in Roswell. And El Paso was an amazing place in the 20s. It was it's always been a crossroads, but it was full of people who were on their way everywhere. There was a big Chinese community, there was a Mexican community, and there was just an international community. Plus, the newspaper staff were all people who were on their way to a bigger newspaper, or were out west because you could go, it was during Prohibition, you could go across the river and drink, or because there were so many sanitariums and healthcare places that they had been drinking too much and in too many smoke-filled rooms, and they came out. So she met this whole cadre of people that were just kind of incredible. And later, they won Nobel Prize or Pulitzer Prizes, they taught in universities, they wrote books, and they became editors of some of the big newspapers around. But one of them had worked for the International News Service in London, and he helped her get a job in London. And so after a year or 2 years at the El Paso Times, she was off to London. She came home to see her family before she went across the Atlantic, and her mother was sick, so she stuck around for a little while, and then she had an appendicitis, and so she stuck around a little longer, and she stayed. And then she was a reporter here for more than 40 years. So she was
on her way to London and got sidetracked in Springfield, Missouri.
By the hills and hollers of the Ozarks.
That's incredible. Just incredible.
You mentioned that she started off as a school teacher.
Yes.
So what kind of grade school?
Grade school. Apparently in those days, she graduated from high school in 1915, and she had already taken some courses on on teaching.
Yeah.
And then she went to Drury for a year and taught after that, but she also went back to Missouri, the normal school, which became Missouri State, and studied there also. She never got a degree.
Oh, okay.
But apparently
you could get a certification.
You could get a certification if you took a test.
Right.
And I should add, the reason I know what she said and what she thought was because she left all of her papers to the State Historical Society. And they microfilmed them all and gave them back to my mother and my uncle and another cousin who were her three heirs. And as I did this research, people would say, "Oh, I've got a box of Lucille stuff in the basement."
But what great resource that is.
Fabulous. And it is now, the original stuff is at the Library Center being digitized.
Yeah.
I gave it all to
That's a
them.
very similar story to Making It in Court.
Yeah.
And the book that came out just recently, the same thing, just this treasure trove of all boxes of stuff and like sitting around. What am I going to do? Well, we probably should write a book.
Yeah.
So, very similar kind of background. Interesting.
Yeah, but it was interesting because she and her two brothers were both successful. And I can only surmise that they thought a lot of themselves. She saved the boyfriend's letters. She wrote letters to her best friend, who was another woman reporter named Dosha Carroll. That's an old name from Springfield.
Oh, yeah.
And Dosha went to Japan and then ended up in San Francisco as editor of a Japanese airline magazine. And Lucille wrote to Dosha for years and years and years. There were copies of those letters. And then she gave a lot of speeches and she wrote them all out. And so when she talked to different groups, and I have all of that material, so I can say she said,
Wow,
but really mostly she wrote.
With some authority.
I was talking about the fact that all of her papers are now at the Springfield, Greene County Local History Department, and they're being digitized. So everybody in Springfield can go check. And there's some amazing things in there. She knew a lot of people, did a lot of things, and she kept scrapbooks of all of her articles. So they're easy to find also.
My goodness. Yeah, that is amazing. Now, for most of her time here, was she just a general reporter, or did she have a byline? Did she have like the editor had on the bias? Did she have her own byline? Or?
She wrote columns. She was a regular reporter, but she also had a column nearly the whole time she was here. She did a book column, And she also did, for a little while, I don't know if it was ballads or old time music column. People would send her in. She had issues with Vance Randolph because he collected. Of course, he's known. He was the Ozark
He cornered the market on
music
that.
collector. But if she got a hold of something that he wanted, he was very persistent. And there's some letters back and forth that are funny about that. But she later took over a column that was called The Wastebasket, which became Over the Ozarks. And that was a reader-supplied column. There were poems and essays and just letters from readers all over the United States, as it turned out. And she was very loyal to those contributors. She got to know a lot of them. She always answered every letter that came in. She sent Christmas cards. She had postcards made with her picture. One year it was with her dog, but with the columns. And she would send those out to all of the people that she got letters from. Later, during the war, well, I should back up here. She got married in 1936, and to a court reporter, a court reporter who worked for Judge Keep, I think. And as was the custom, she had to quit her job, which didn't slow her down at all. She was giving talks, and she was occasionally writing an article for the paper just because she wanted to. But after World War II started, she was having coffee with a bunch of newspaper people. And George Olds, who was the managing editor, asked her to come back to work. She said, well, I can't. I've got 2 stepsons and a stepdaughter and a husband, but I might do a column if it could be an antidote to the war. And he said, sure, let me know what you want to do. And so she was well acquainted with the library, and she went and looked at old newspapers and put together the first one of the Good Old Days columns. It's a letter to an auntie. Dear Auntie, here's what's going on in Springfield from 50 years before. And she did it in a way that she picked articles from 50 years ago news that were parallel to what was going on in the U.S. I didn't know that the United States nearly went to war with Chile. But one time, at one point, there was a little notice in the Good Old Days letter about that, and sure enough, there was some kind of altercation going on in the news at the time. But I brought you a copy of the Good Old Days column that she would have written, or that she did write 50 years ago today, which is the news from 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah, it's September 2nd. You got September 2nd here and August 30th.
Yep. But she talked about 50 years ago when she did her column. She talked about Uncle Ike, the postmaster from Shepherd of the Hills. Yep. He was celebrating his 87th birthday. And she talked about the old Empress Theater, which I'd never heard of before, but it began as a livery stable, turned into a theater with burlesques and then movies. And then it was, in 1923, it was being torn down. She said the weather was cool. The low in the morning was 42, or the high in the morning was 42, which would be really nice. And then 4th of July had been 100.
See, that's one of the things that in homage to her, that's one of the things I do on this show is coming out of the breaks at the bottom of the hour. I've gone back in a much easier way than she had, going through those big old bound sets of volumes of the newspaper. I go online and just put in a date and put in a location, and it brings up all the newspapers from that day, and you just sit there and read them. But I do one for 100 years ago. So I've got that same theater article in there today because I thought it was so interesting that it was started as a livery stable in the 1880s, and then it was converted to a theater by Dr. Deemer, who had Deemer's Theater over on Commercial Street. And so, yeah, that's one of my headlines for today. So, yeah.
So you're carrying on the tradition.
Oh, absolutely.
That's great.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's
But something I can sit and do in a few minutes rather than going through these huge bound, full sheet books of the newspaper and just going through those and just the dust and those were the good old days, but not.
The only other thing I noticed in that column was the song, Yes, We Have No Bananas, was popular.
Yeah.
Yes, we have no bananas, yeah.
So how much editorial work was done for columnists? Were columnists able to pretty much write at will, or was there an editorial element that was kind of exercised over what they did, what she did?
I don't know about, excuse me, in the days when Lucille was employed by the newspaper, but Mike O'Brien, who was a
Yeah.
colleague of mine when I was at the paper, was Sunday editor when Lucille would bring in the Good Old Days column. And he cringes when he talks about it because he said he couldn't, if he ever tried to shorten anything or
Oh,
change anything that she'd written, he said it was very difficult.
Yeah.
So I think mostly, at least Lucille was left alone.
Yeah. But but somebody like George Oles, George was a stickler for exactly how things should be. He left the newspaper over that because he felt like that the newspaper wasn't printing enough local news, and started his own paper.
Right.
So I can't imagine him not having a little bit of control.
Well, I'm sure. I mean,
But not a whole lot.
by the time I was hearing stories from my contemporaries, she was, 2 generations older than we
Oh,
were.
yeah.
So you kind of had a lot of respect for age, if nothing else.
So how long did it take you to write this book? How long did it take you? Because you got footnotes in the back of this that is bigger than some books. I mean,
Had an academic press publisher. So
yeah,
that
there
made
you
a
go.
difference.
Yeah.
I actually started thinking about it, I guess about the time she died. And I was living in Chicago and came down here in 1995 and interviewed some other newspaper reporters, people that I had known, and some friends of hers and editors, an attorney, John
Holston.
Hulston, who had been a great friend of hers and was also from Dade County. And he talked a lot about, his childhood in Dade County and then his relationship with Lucille over the years. He was also a person who, like Lucille, was really, really enthusiastic about seeing that Wilson's Creek Civil War battlefield was turned
Right.
into a national park, and that the Nathan Boone home in Ash Grove was also turned into a state park. And they worked together a lot. He said, he was a great quote I found in my old notes. He said that he'd started working for the newspaper about the time that she came back to work full time after her husband died. And he said, I'd always go see Lucille and we would conspire about Wilson's Creek or about the Nathan Boone house.
I can see that. John was a great historian.
Yes, he wrote a bunch of books that were very helpful.
Absolutely, yeah, very good historian. So, does this book cover her whole life or just her career in newspaper?
Her whole life.
Her whole life.
Her whole life. She was born in Dadeville in 1898, which made her eligible to vote in the first election that women could ever vote in.
Wow.
Oh,
And
Yeah.
so her life, I didn't intend it, but this book is kind of a feminist book because it traces the arc of 20th century feminism.
right.
She died in 1992. She was 94 years old. And she had written that column up until her late 80s, I believe.
Mhm.
So she was around and about and doing things, and she gave talks when she was young, or when she was older, to women's groups and civic groups, and about women and her career. And she basically told them all, she said, you can do whatever you want if you're qualified and just want to work hard. And on occasion, she took aim at the organized feminists.
There were other ladies that we have had conversations about on numerous times that were also involved in newspapers. And what was their relationship like? Were they competitive? Did they all work together? How was their relationship as far as, say, Lucille Morris Upton and I don't know.
Docia Carroll.
Docia Carroll, or, yeah.
As far as I could tell, Lucille was friends with the other women reporters, and there were always, even in Denver, there were always women reporters who had been there before she had. Nobody told us.
Yeah.
But Docia Carroll came to the paper about the same time Lucille did, and they were great friends all of their lives. There was another woman who was at the paper who married and went to Washington, D.C., and worked for the Associated Press. And she was part of women's news conferences that were held by Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House. And those started out as what you might think, you know, talking about what the White House was gonna serve at their upcoming dinners and decorations,
Social gathering.
Yeah,
social gathering,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then it became really hard news about what was going on with prohibition and different
Right.
social issues.
Right.
So these women were not just sitting around. But the woman that was the biggest part of Lucille's career that people remember was Betty Love, who was a photographer.
right.
And Betty started, like Lucille, in a different career. She was an art teacher in junior high, Jarrett Junior
Jared
High.
Junior High.
And just before World War II, I
Right,
think.
right, yeah, right. But she taught for 12 years there at Jared. Yeah.
And she got tired of the school politics.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a more complicated story, but she asked for a summer job
Yeah.
and became an illustrator at the paper for a couple of years. And then when war shifted people around, she said, well, I want to be a photographer. And she turned out to be
Because
a
because
legendary
yeah,
photographer for the
because
paper.
of her art background, her vision, her
Right.
seeing a picture was just extraordinary as a photographer
But managing editor George Olds had a column called On the Bias.
on the bias. Right.
And he wrote a column about Betty. And I can read part of it that was in here. He said, it's a plug for Springfield newspapers on the one hand, but it's a really backhanded compliment on the other. He said, we've always had girl reporters because we've always tried to hire the best people possible. We hired them as persons, as individuals, not as men or women, proving they had the ability, the personality, and the loyalty. The only reason we haven't had more girls on the staff is that good girl reporters are relatively much scarcer than good men reporters. But somehow it never occurred to us to have a girl photographer. And he went on to say that.
Right.
Can you imagine him trying to say this today?
Yeah. Well, that big.
He promoted his girls.
Yeah, that big speed graphic. I mean, you think about a photographer today with their little 35mm camera. That speed graphic that they toted around was about 25 pounds, and and you had a big bag then with light bulbs and all kinds of stuff in it. It was a handful.
Yeah. In about 1950, after Lucille had been back at work for a couple of years or a few years, they started putting Betty and Lucille together on stories. And Lucille talked a couple of times about, she kept the money because Betty had all this photography equipment that she had to carry. But got to be, at least according to the news staff, that their adventures, their stories, the adventures of them getting their stories was often a much better story than what appeared in the paper. Yeah. The one that I think is best known was the result of Table Rock Lake being formed and a lecture at the Historical Society. Lucille listened to a fellow named Marvin Tong talk about the fact that the old Philibert Cemetery on the James River was going to be covered over by the rising waters of Table Rock Lake. And Lucille went to work the next morning and said, Betty and I have to go out there and do a story on that cemetery before it disappears. So they got their assignment and Tong took them out there. And apparently the road down there was really rough, because Lucille described it in her story. And when they got there, the bridge was out. So it was going to be hours to get around to the other side. And there was a fisherman, and he said, why don't you walk? Why don't you walk through the water? So Betty had on slacks, which was worth noting in those days because women didn't do that. And she rolled up her pants legs, and Lucille took off her shoes and hiked up her skirt and waded into the river. And Betty, of course, took a picture. And by that time, Lucille was, I don't know if it was insurance, but she carried a little camera with her all the time around her neck. And so she took a picture of Betty. And they got across the river, and she took notes on the cemetery and the gravestones, and Betty took her pictures. Well, then here they are, sopping wet, and they got to go back. And Lucille said, when she described this in the spread in the newspaper, and she said, there we were, wet and everything. And then just like in the movies, we were saved. A boat came around a corner and they waved at them. And the woman in the boat looked at them both and said, well, you're Betty Love. Lucille was well known because of her columns and because she'd been there a long time. But Betty took people's pictures. And you remember that. And Betty had taken this gal's picture several years before. She'd won a scholarship in high school. And so they pulled over, and Lucille and Betty climbed in on top of camping equipment, and they were ferried back across the river. And then the good news at the end was a couple weeks later, the Corps of Engineers moved the cemetery. It's in Kimberley City, and I think it's called the Philibert Cemetery, but there's like 20 small cemeteries in that area.
Right.
So they saved the cemetery.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
extraordinary. Yeah, those kinds of adventures, they're hard to come up with now. I mean, you got your cell phone, you got all the other stuff, which that was, yeah. Anyway, there's just way too much communication now. You were on, back then, you tucked it under your arm and you were on your own, so.
Is there time for two more stories?
Oh, sure.
One small
One story and then I've got to do a break and then we'll do the other.
Okay, well, the one story is small. They were at a party, I guess women from the paper, because the city desk called the party and said, Lucille and Betty, go over to, there's a bank robbery going on in Republic at the Farmer State Bank. Get over there. And as Lucille left, and this was, Elizabeth McCann told me this. She was one of the people I interviewed when I came up in 1995. She said as they left, Lucille turned around and said, well, we may get shot, but we're going.
We may get shot, but we're going.
When they got over there, the police had the robbery under control, and they had the two robbers inside,
Yeah.
arrested. Lucille went to talk to them, and Betty leaned into the car. The getaway driver was handcuffed in the back of the car. He was very drunk. And he looked at her and gave her a big smile, and again he said, "Oh, Betty, did you come to take my picture?" The subsequent stories in the paper were really funny, but the two guys that had been the robbers went to jail, and the guy that was supposed to be the getaway driver was really so out of it that he couldn't even remember if he'd driven the car, much less been part of the burglary, and so they let him go.